In this video, we will be looking at how to answer an exam question on Mr. Birling from An Inspector Calls. This has been a very popular request from lots of students that have reached out. So here I am starting the series on An Inspector Calls, and I plan to post videos every week to every other week on the run up to your exams this May, June. Okay, let's get started. So, if you get a question on Mr. Birling, you should know the basics about him and understand who he is, what he does, etc. So, he is the head of the Birling family. He's a successful businessman slash manufacturer. So he's fairly wealthy. He's like upper middle class. He's a prominent figure in the Bromley community. So he was Lord Mayor for 2 years. He was previously an alderman. He's currently a local magistrate, and he is expecting to be granted a knighthood. So he has held significant roles in his community. He fired Eva Smith, and that's the reason why the inspector is there to speak to him. And over the course of the play, and obviously through the inspector, he learns that all his family members, including Gerald, who is his future son-in-law at that point, have all mistreated her in some way and significantly affected the course of her life, and that leads her to commit suicide. So by the end of the play, I think the most telling thing about Mr. Birling is he shows no remorse for his own actions or for his family's actions towards Eva Smith. And that's very telling about his character. But we have to think beyond that. It's not just about disliking Mr. Birling. We have to think about Priestley, the playwright, and what his intentions really are through this character. So first of all, you should absolutely in your introduction be mentioning the fact that Mr. Birling is a symbol of capitalism. His character is used by Priestley. Okay, so some things to know about J.B. Priestley, who wrote the play. He's a socialist, and his aim in writing this play was to really undermine capitalism, which is the economic system of Great Britain during this time that it's written, which is 1945, and he wants to promote socialism to that original audience. Okay, so what he's really done is created a morality play. The whole point of this play is to come away from it having learnt something, having learnt a lesson. And there are elements of melodrama as well, but essentially it's a morality play. So you want to really be focusing on, going that bit further, not just thinking about Mr. Birling, but thinking about the ideology that he represents and what J.B. Priestley is trying to say about that ideology, and what lessons he wants you to take away from this when viewing it as an audience, particularly the audience in 1945. That obviously would have been the audience that he would have written for. Some things to know about the original audience. So this was first played in 1945. So essentially this play was written for them by Priestley. There are a few things to keep in mind when they turn up to this play in 1945 and watch it on stage. There are things they know that's happened, right? Because the play is set in 1912. So lots of things have happened between 1912 and 1945. So they know that the Titanic sinks. They have seen 2 world wars, World War I and World War II. The suffragette movement has achieved great things, right, such as votes for women. There is the Great Slump, otherwise known as the Great Depression, which was started with the Wall Street crash. But, there's grave poverty during the 1930s. And they've also witnessed workers' strikes across the nation, especially because of so many people fighting and putting their lives on the line for their country to come home and say, you know what, we're not happy with the status quo, things need to change. We want better pay, we want better living situation, and so on. Okay, so one thing to mention is if you are doing the Edexcel IGCSE exam, you don't have to talk about context in great detail. When you include context, you want to include it just to show what Priestley was trying to do. Okay, and I'll kind of explain that as we go along. If you are doing other exam boards, you may want to check with your mark scheme to see how much detail you have to give on context. I will not be going in as much detail on context. As an example, if you're doing AQA, I believe you have to go in a lot more context, but I am not an expert on AQA, so please speak to your teachers or reference your mark schemes to double check that. For Edexcel students, there are 3 elements that the examiner is looking for in your analysis. You need to comment on language, you need to comment on form, you need to comment on structure. So throughout this presentation, you're going to notice that I use these colours to indicate when that analysis is on language, when it's on form, and when it's on structure, to hopefully help you with your revision. It's really important that you include all 3. If you only include 1 or 2, no matter how good your analysis is, it's going to really hold you back from getting top marks. So my advice is to start, after you've written your introduction, is to really start with how we, from the very beginning of the play, get a sense that actually Mr. Birling is insecure. And I think this is really a great way of showing your critical analysis, because that's another thing that the examiner's looking for. Okay, so thinking outside of the box and not just thinking that, you know, Mr. Birling is a horrid character and that's it, but actually trying to think about where his actions stem from. And I would argue he's actually incredibly insecure. So how can I back that up? First of all, think about the way he speaks. He's described as being provincial in speech. He is also, his wife, Sybil Birling, is his superior, so he married up, and that tells us that he's not from an upper middle class background. So he has worked his way up through the ranks, if you like, and his wife even speaks to him reproachfully at times. So there's this sense that he's a bit of an outsider. So we get that from those stage directions. So zooming into that, remember, to get those high marks for analysis, you want to pick that apart. So looking at the word provincial, it really suggests that he's speaking in an unsophisticated manner. And that really kind of juxtaposes him with the formal setting of his home, as well as his wife, right? His wife is very formal and very rigid in the way things are supposed to be done. And just the unsophisticated way that he speaks just sets him a little bit like an outsider on stage. So that hierarchical reference as well, being referred to as inferior, basically saying that Sybil is his social superior. What does that tell you? It really tells us that the class structure in which Mr. Birling lives is really rigid, and with that comes a snobbery. Okay, and it explains the way he behaves a little later on, which we'll look at. So the audience witnessed that snobbery in the way Mrs. Birling speaks to Mr. Birling. So looking at that stage direction where she speaks to him reproachfully, and she says something along the lines of like, you shouldn't say it like that, or something along those lines. So that adverb reproachfully reflects how disapproving she is of her husband, because he's failing to conform to the polite practices of their social class at that point. And that tells us something about kind of the marriage dynamics between Mr. and Mrs. Birling as well, as they notice, or at least the audience start to see, the effects of a class-based system in the way that it creates this hostility between classes, even between husband and wife. So even though Mr. Birling business-wise has done really well for himself, there is a sense that he will never belong. And you could argue that he knows that by the way that he acts himself. So when speaking to Gerald, now keep in mind, Gerald is from an upper class, okay? And he says, it's exactly the same port your father gets as he gets this port out. So we kind of see in that the effect that classism has had on Mr. Birling, because what he's really trying to do here is impress Gerald by drinking the same port as Lord Croft, which is Gerald's father. And it's just this desperate attempt to be accepted by the upper class. Port is a symbol of wealth and status, and it's a feeble attempt really to gain respect from the Crofts. And you might say it hasn't, any attempt hasn't worked. Like, it's quite telling that the Crofts are not present. And we learn later that, well, not late, a little later, um, that the Crofts are not happy with Gerald marrying Sheila because she is considered below his social class. And so that kind of explains probably why the Croft family are not there, because they look down at the likes of Mr. Birling. So it's kind of ironic, right? Because Mr. Birling is so cruel to the working class, and you might expect him to have more compassion, considering the fact that he is experiencing classism himself by the Crofts. Um, but what this use of irony does is Priestley's drawing attention to the way social divisions create insecurity and cruelty. So rather than making Mr. Birling compassionate, it actually just makes him really insecure and cruel to others, as he tries to kind of preserve his own class. In Act 3, he mentions public scandal 3 times. So it's clear that his primary concern is protecting his public image. And that highlights how precarious Mr. Birling's social position is. And because he has such a fragile hold on his social status, it can potentially explain why he is so heartless towards those less fortunate, because fear makes people selfish and cruel. So I think overall, you've got to think about what is Priestley trying to say to the audience. Remember, this is a morality play. What are the morals that he wants them to kind of walk away with? So I think what he's trying to say is look at what a hostile environment is created with a class-based society. And what he's trying to do is get the audience to consider a socialist classless system as an alternative. And then this can explain, that insecurity can explain his arrogance, right? This sense that he needs to show that he knows what he's talking about, and he can't admit he's wrong. All of that, I would say, really stems from an insecurity. So how do we see this arrogance? First of all, just in general, the fact that he speaks at length so much at the beginning of Act 1, it reflects his self-importance and clearly suggests that Mr. Birling thinks his ideas are superior, and therefore he should be the one in the room that everyone listens to. And we see this when he interrupts Eric. Eric says something like, well, what about war? Which is a really credible thing to, or valid point to raise, right? And the audience know that because they know since 1912, when this is set, they've had 2 world wars. So Eric is absolutely right to be concerned about the prospect of war, okay? But Mr. Birling doesn't let Eric finish. He interrupts him and ironically says, just let me finish, Eric, like he hasn't spoken enough. And that interruption just shows that Mr. Birling thinks that his viewpoint is worthier, that he's the one that knows what's going to happen and everyone should listen to him. So that ignorance to other people's opinions foreshadows his inability to change by the end of the play, because he's also incapable of listening to the inspector, who arguably is the wisest man in the room or on stage. So he's incapable of change because his imperiousness gets in the way, that self-importance. And then within those monologues, we see a lot of forecasting what's going to happen in the future. I've only chosen 2, but there are plenty more that you could choose. So he tells Sheila and Gerald, you'll be marrying at a very good time. Yes, a very good time. Unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. Here he's talking about the Titanic. So first of all, we just look at that. I'm going to mention dramatic irony. And just a reminder, how is that dramatic irony? Because the audience know that Sheila and Gerald will not be marrying at a good time. They'll be marrying just before World War One, and after that there'll be the Great Slump, and after that there'll be World War Two. They've got a terrible time ahead of them. And of course, mentioning that the Titanic is unsinkable, everyone knows famously or infamously that the Titanic sunk. So when speaking of the future, Mr. Birling speaks in declarative. So that's when you say your opinion, but you say it as fact, you declare it. And he often repeats his phrases to emphasize how confident he is with his forecast. The adverb absolutely also mirrors that blind certainty he has, and that really only aggravates the audience because they know he's so incorrect about what's going to happen. So you can imagine the frustration of them sitting there right? Going, he has no clue what's about to hit him. So that apparent confidence, I say apparent because I've already said that, I think this all really stems from an insecurity. And I think we see signs of that in the way that if you look at his monologues, they're full of dashes and hesitations. And I think that actually suggests a lack of understanding of the topics. And it suggests that he's struggling to articulate himself. And maybe that goes back to him being provincial in speech, or he's kind of making things up as he goes along and he doesn't really have the knowledge to back it up. He's just kind of talking for the sake of it almost. So this creation of dramatic irony encourages the audience to question his judgment and therefore to question the capitalist ideology that Mr. Birling presents. And of course, he is a capitalist. He is almost capitalism personified, okay? And there's so many different quotations you could use. I've tried to choose ones that I think give you great opportunity for analysis. So first of all, in the opening stage directions, he is described as heavy looking, right? So he's a larger man. And I think that's done to symbolize his greed. Now, I'm trying to think about the 1945 audience, which would have been mostly Christian at that time. And so I think this is a reference to gluttony, that being one of the 7 deadly sins in the Christian faith. And it's believed that gluttony is a pathway to comfort that intends to satisfy something much deeper that we are craving. So maybe again, going back to that insecurity, perhaps there is an emptiness in Mr. Birling that he fails to fill with materialistic things. In many ways, he is the personification of capitalism, an economic system driven by the desire to earn money, right? Driven by greed, basically. So Priestley tries to use Mr. Birling as an example of how such a system metaphorically starves us of more important things such as love and community. And instead, we focus on these unsentimental things, right? Luxury, material possessions, social class. And when he is delivering a speech that is intended to celebrate the engagement of Sheila and Gerald, what does he talk about? Business. And he talks about how the Crofts and the Birling family can come together because they are competitors, but maybe they can come together and become one business for lower costs and higher prices. So that business jargon is juxtaposed with what we would expect from a speech where you are celebrating the engagement of your daughter and son-in-law. So it highlights how unsentimental a man Mr. Birling is. He's not focused on love between the couple. He's much more concerned with the business opportunity that this union will bring him. If you look at the language, it's very simple, it's very businesslike, it's devoid of emotion, right? He should be saying how proud he is of his daughter and speaking about the great bond that they have with one another. Instead, he's just talking about business. And really that kind of the lack of emotion in his language shows that Mr. Birling fails to consider the humans involved, right? And that goes beyond this speech, right? He fails to consider the humans involved in the engagement, right? He's not really considering Sheila and Gerald, but also beyond that in life, he fails to consider the humans involved in his business, right? He just refers to them as lower costs, right? These are people. This is Eva Smith and all her colleagues. And this is again further supported when he says it is my duty to keep labour costs down. That is his justification for his poor treatment of his workforce. So that's what he believes is his responsibility as a business owner. But if we zoom into the word duty, right, that's really ironic to use that because he seems to take his responsibility towards profit making very seriously. But what you could argue here is he has forgotten his other responsibilities, such as his responsibility to his family, to his workforce, and to his wider community, okay? Even just think about the way he is at the end of the play, he should be mortified that his own family have behaved in the way they have and have mistreated Eva Smith so in the way that they did. But he's not. He's triumphant. He can't believe, he thinks he's got away with it. So he's kind of failed as a father, as well as a businessman, you might argue. Um, Also considering when I say his wider community, you have to think about the public roles that he has held, right? He's been an alderman and a Lord Mayor. Um, it appears that Mr. Birling only likes to fulfil his responsibilities when they serve him. And of course, here we're talking about his responsibilities as a capitalist, but what about his responsibilities as a human being, or, someone as a mayor, as an alderman? He doesn't seem to really care about those responsibilities to the people. And then thinking about his stance on capitalism versus socialism. So here he's kind of complaining about what some people are talking about. So there's obviously some talk about kind of community progressing and changing, as if we were all mixed up together like bees in a hive, community and all that nonsense. So that simile that likens community to a beehive is ironic, because actually beehives are incredibly impressive, right? They're complex, the way they work together, to ensure the well-being of all its members. And it should be something to be admired and mirrored, not mocked and dismissed, which is evident in the language that he uses, nonsense. So Mr. Birling here is openly rejecting the socialist ideals of community and equality, and he's firmly placing his support with a capitalist and class-based society. So, if you should hate him by now, because that's exactly what Priestley's trying to do, right? If you dislike Mr. Birling, the point of Priestley is he wants you to dislike capitalism. We did kind of just talk about kind of the lack of emotion he has and the failure he has had as, the responsibilities of a father, the responsibilities of as a human being. And I think you could really zoom into how he is with his family and how heartless he seems. So those opening stage directions describe his home as not cozy or home-like. And so that really tells us there's no warmth, there's no kind of, it's not a sense of welcome, there's nothing inviting about his home. And so as the father, as the head of the household, he's really failed to nurture a loving home life for his family. And we can see that in their interactions and in their dialogue. So looking at what Mr. Birling says, he says a man has to make his own way, has to look after himself and his family too. Look at the adjective own and the pronoun himself. That really highlights the selfishness of Mr. Birling. And of course, Priestley would argue this is encouraged, this selfishness is encouraged by the capitalist economic system. But look at the structure as well of that sentence. Notice that family comes at the end of that sentence, and that really reflects the order of Mr. Birling's priorities. He comes before his own family. The hyphen as well, you might say, presents his family like an afterthought. Really, the first thing he thinks of is a man has to make his own way, has to look after himself. Oh yeah, and his family too, right? It's a bit of an afterthought, which suggests that's how he's been, that's the type of father he's been. His family have been an afterthought. And I would say that is supported by what Mrs. Birling says. This is her speaking to Sheila. And she says, you'll realise that men with important work to do sometimes have to spend nearly all their time and energy on their business. You'll have to get used to that, just as I had. So her dialogue reflects Mr. Birling's priorities. The expression, spend nearly all their time and energy, underlines how devoted he is to his business, which leaves little time, if any, for his family. So there's a sense of neglect there, you might even argue. And then I think this really bugged me when I still recall reading this a long, long time ago when I was much, much younger, and getting really bugged with the way he responded to learning that Gerald had been unfaithful to Sheila. And rather than taking his daughter's side and standing up for her and saying, Gerald, you've let me down, there's no way I'd want my daughter to marry you, she hands back her engagement ring and he instantly tries to talk her into not doing that and defending Gerald. So he says, you must understand that a lot of young men, and thankfully Sheila interrupts him and says she doesn't want to hear it. So this reaction is antithetical. It means the complete opposite of what one would expect from a father. The modal verb must creates a sense of urgency, reflecting Mr. Birling's sense of panic. So his instinct is to defend Gerald, which tells us a lot. It tells us that this engagement is all about benefiting Mr. Birling and not about making Sheila happy. So Mr. Birling really sees this marriage as transactional, right? And Sheila is more like a bargaining chip than a daughter to him. It also raises questions regarding his own relationship with Mrs. Birling. He's so dismissive about Gerald's unfaithfulness. That tells me that he's probably behaved the same, the way he's so easy to justify it. And then, of course, we hear directly from Eric as well, when Eric's explaining why he didn't come to Mr. Birling when he was in trouble. And he says, "You're not the kind of father a chap could go to when he's in trouble." Up until this point, the audience has witnessed countless times when Eric is ridiculed and undermined by his father. So it's not surprising that Eric does not feel like he could confide in him. So this is just a loveless family. And again, what is Priestley trying to do? He wants you to watch this, or at least the 1945 audience. And it'd be so easy to look at the surface of this family and see all the wonderful things they have, the beautiful living room, the nice clothes, and to think that you want that. But he's delving in deep and going, look how soulless this family is, okay? And he's saying this isn't something we should aspire to. As a society, we have more important things to aspire to, like community, equality, and so on. And finally, well, it's not finally, it's almost my last point. He's also corrupt, okay? We see that in the kind of not so subtle, I would say, ways that he tries to intimidate the inspector. So he says, "How do you get on with our Chief Constable, Colonel Roberts? I ought to warn you that he's an old friend of mine." So here he's name dropping, right? And what he's trying to do is use his network to benefit himself. So the verb warn creates a threatening tone. And what he's really trying to say to the inspector is stop investigating now, stop asking questions. We don't know anything about the Chief Constable, but the fact that Mr. Birling feels comfortable enough to use his name as a threat tells me that corruption goes far beyond Mr. Birling and is embedded, if you like, in the kind of upper ranks of society. And kind of ironic, right, that this is a police officer and they should be upholding the law. Everyone should be equal before the law, but here it is heavily suggested that Colonel Roberts is probably corrupt as well. So the audience, therefore, are encouraged to question the morality of those who are wealthy and influential in their society and reconsider who should hold power. He, again, more name dropping. Okay, I was an alderman for years and Lord Mayor for 2 years ago, and I'm still on the bench, so I know the Brumley offices pretty well. So the listing of prominent positions that Mr. Birling has held is another attempt for Mr. Birling to intimidate the inspector. Now, there's lots of different ways to read the dashes and how they might be delivered on stage. I see them as kind of like Mr. Birling attempting a dramatic pause to add emphasis, like, I was an alderman for years and Lord Mayor, still on the bench, like almost like he's expecting the inspector to be really impressed and be like, oh wow, after each one. But that's kind of the way I read it. But if anything, it's definitely to add emphasis to those positions. So it's ironic, and we've kind of talked about this already, that Mr. Birling's held positions that should come with a great sense of responsibility to his community. As an example, I believe to become a Lord Mayor, you have to be voted in, but you certainly have a responsibility to the community before you. Yet he only seems to use these roles to benefit and safeguard himself. And this is reiterated by the inspector. The inspector noticed this as well, and he says to Mr. Birling, "Public men, Mr. Birling, have responsibilities as well as privileges." So there is the inspector, really the voice of Priestley, trying to say to the audience, you should carefully consider who are in positions of power, who make decisions for you, who are supposed to be safeguarding you, right? Not themselves. And again, it's just encouraging a review of what society was like then and how it should be organised differently. And then towards the end, this is when he's getting desperate, right? Because he realises there's going to be a public scandal. And he says unhappily, "Look, Inspector, I think I've written that incorrectly. I'm sure he says, look, Inspector, I'd give thousands. Yes, thousands. I'm sure that should say I'd give. So you could read this and say, wow, that's a genuine sign of remorse from Mr. Birling. He's finally seen the light. But what we have to do is take this in the context of the play. If you look at how he behaves at the end of the play, there are plenty of stage directions that suggest he is not remorseful at all. One of them being that he speaks triumphantly. So it's so clear that this is an attempt to bribe the inspector. The repetition of thousands adds emphasis to the amount of money Mr. Birling is willing to pay to get rid of this scandal. And again, this just highlights that his sole concern is himself, right? His self-preservation. It's a deeply ingrained selfishness that Priestley would argue has been encouraged by a capitalist economic system, right? Where you look after yourself. And then finally, I think it's really important to draw your essay to a close by mentioning the fact that he doesn't change, he does not learn his lesson, and that makes him a static character. So at the beginning of the play, he's described, and I've focused on stage directions here, because if you are struggling to incorporate stage directions, which is form on the mark scheme, then you could leave this as your final point to make sure you're showing the examiner, look, I'm looking at stage directions. But if you look at the beginning of the play, he's portentous. That means kind of self-important. He's got fairly easy manners. He's very relaxed. He beams. He's happy. He clearly relaxes. And then at the end, he's triumphant. He's jovial. He's amused. He's heartily. Right? There doesn't seem to be any change. Right? He should be shaken to the core from what he's realised about himself and his family, but nothing's changed. And so it's clear that no lessons have been learned from the inspector's visit. Having failed to undergo any sort of character development, Mr. Birling can be described as a static character. Priestley chose for him to remain unchanged, which starkly contrasts to his children, right? Eric and Sheila, who undergo great change. They would be considered dynamic characters. But Priestley does that because he wants to highlight that hope can only lie with the younger generation. They're the generation that can change or can make change for everyone else. So he's really encouraging the audience to turn away from the older generation and to dismiss their stubborn grasp on the old way of life and say, we've got to move forward, we've got to make progress. And we cannot do that if we look towards the older generation or the more established upper classes and think they're going to show us the way. So, hopefully that's given you a good overview of Mr. Birling. And please try in your conclusion to consider the overall message of Priestley. And I think it comes down to two main things. One, he's trying to highlight through the character of Mr. Birling that capitalism, because remember, he is kind of capitalism personified, is a corrupt system that exploits the weak and protects the rich. And I think beside that, being a member of the older generation, he's trying to highlight that they are too stubborn and rigid in their ways and their beliefs to ever achieve real progress in society. So really, he wants the audience to walk away reconsidering capitalism and reconsidering who they look up to in their society to lead their way and to make decisions for them. As always, please share your own thoughts. There are so many different quotations I could have used. I had to cut this down by more than half. This is a really meaty play, so there's so many different quotations you could use. Feel free to share those in the comment section and include your own analysis, or if there's something you disagree with, please critically analyse me. I encourage that. That's how you get top marks in your exam. And if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me, Mrs. Rumsey at mrsrumsey.com.